Hello and welcome to the Bottom Up Skills Podcast. I'm Mike Parsons, I'm the CEO of Qualitons, and we are going to ask this question. Shall we pivot or persevere with our product? And this is an essential, a critical, a fundamental idea inside of the lean startup, and we're going to dive into it. I got to tell you, this one's a good one. And you know what? I honestly think it is so underestimated because I see way too many times companies persevering with products, services, and experiences that really should have been pivoted. And what's really fascinating is if you actually look at a lot of successful companies, they're made up of a series of really well thought out, rigorous decision-making around this choice between a pivot or to persevere. So I'm hopefully going to decode and unlock this for you today. This is a very, very important piece of the lean startup. It is an essential thing to embrace. It's going to help you build a better product. And it's going to, as you would only expect from Eric Ries and the lean startup, it's going to give you some very strong accountability on how to build a better product, to make something that's actually worth using and worth building. Okay, so a little bit of context here when we talk about this pivot or persevere question. It's all done in this context of learning, right? And it's the build, measure, learn loop that is the lean startup. And I got to tell you, it's all iterate, continuity. You don't just ask this question once. You ask it all the time. Do we pivot? Do we persevere? Because you're in a continuous cycle, a continuous loop of growing your product, step by step, question by question, proving out your hypothesis or disproving your hypothesis and building a new one. So let's kind of try and bring ourselves into what the pivot or persevere question looks like and how it works. Okay, first let's just get the definition right. A pivot is, if you think about it, it's a change in the strategy without changing the vision. So what I mean by that is you can have this huge vision to help a particular customer segment. Maybe it is to fix a big problem in the world. That's great. That doesn't have to change. But how are you going to get there, right? What's the strategy for doing that? That can change a lot. And the pivot is this moment where after measuring, we change the hypothesis and we try a new approach that might yield better results. Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. That one's pretty deep. So, you're building a product. Let's say it's a podcast app, and you have this idea that there's not enough conversation and commenting and sharing of podcasts. It's all a bit ad hoc and it's too hard. And your vision is that you want to get the very best relevant content to people around the world. You think it's too hard to find. There's too much hidden treasure. There's all these rough diamonds hiding out in the world, and you want to make it easy for people to discover new podcasts. Okay, that's your vision of the world, and you think people will be much happier if they get access to lots of different podcasts. But you might have a particular strategy for maybe you emphasize the commenting of the podcast, or maybe it's the sharing of the podcast or the liking. And you might try this as a strategy in your prototypes, in your MVP. And you might find that, let's say you did it all around reviews, but people just don't want to write reviews for their podcasts. Maybe they don't want to write it because they're too busy listening and you can't do two things at once. Maybe that's what you discover. So you can still stay true to your vision of helping people discover new podcasts, but maybe instead of doing it through the commenting, it's through liking. Or maybe your strategy is not to focus on the liking, but there are different ways of doing it. Maybe there is an algorithm that measures your consumption and you don't have to do anything, and that creates a recommendation engine just like Amazon. I mean, I'm getting a bit excited here about this product actually. But my point is this. You could go so many different ways of having a strategy to realize this vision of a podcast discovery service. So my point is that you might test one of these and you may discover that the strategy is not right and you're going to try a different one. Then hopefully that'll yield better results. That is a pivot. You're like, we tested the route, we just couldn't get the results. Not enough people were reviewing, liking, rating, sharing the podcast. So you know what? We are going to try an alternative strategy to achieve the vision. Now, what's so powerful about pivoting is that if you go to Jeff Bezos, CEO and founder of Amazon, he says, be stubborn on your vision, but flexible on how you get there. And this is exactly what Eric Ries says in the Lean Startup too. Like, don't be too attached to the strategy. And oh my gosh, do I see people so attached to a strategy, particularly in the corporate world. People sell in a strategy and then it's like it can never be changed because that's what we promised to the boss. No, I think you should do it differently. You should promise a vision with a plethora of strategy possibilities that you will test, validate in order to discover the right one. Okay, so we've dealt with the first half of this question, the pivot, right? So you're going to stay true to your vision. Just going to change the strategy. Just keep testing, looking for results. Now, what's the other alternative to the pivot? Persevere. This means a totally different situation where you got this vision, you've tested a strategy, and the results look pretty good. Some might even say encouraging. Now, this is where you really need to persevere. Get really forensic and rigorous. Go deep into all the little tweaks that you can do. And I remember working with a great creative director in the US. And he always had, when he was persevering with a great idea, he always had this visualization of a point system when we would make a great television ad. And he'd say, you start at 100 and every time you change it, you need to be pushing the quality towards 100 out of 100. Likewise, you don't want to make too many changes and start sending it to the negative. So in this case, I want you to imagine that you have some early stage results that give you like a 60, a 70 out of 100. And what your job to do is, if these numbers look good, you want to continually see gradual improvements through your perseverance. So you're testing your product and you're like, hey, the engagement is slowly but surely continually increasing and compounding. So if you go back to our previous episode where we were looking at the engines of growth within Lean Startup, you would want to see an improved usage frequency if it's a sticky product. You would like to see an improvement in the viral coefficient if it's a viral growth engine. And you would want to gradually, but surely, improve your cost per acquisition for a paid product. This is what you want to do. Now, here's the trick. Here's the gotcha. There is no scientific standard to making the pivot or persevere decision. It is a question of judgment. Okay? So it can be subjective. I wish it was more black and white. But here's a rule I would encourage you to consider. You should pivot if you continually get diminishing results of improvement, less increments of improvement. if you start to flatline after several rounds of testing on your product, if you're still kind of at a 60, 70 out of 100 and it's getting harder now, you've kind of explored all the options and you can't get into the 80s or 90s out of 100, this is a moment where this stagnation, this is where you have to ask, have we achieved a sufficient result, or are we struggling and we're running out of momentum? Because if you start to nod to those questions, then you need to consider pivoting. When you should persevere is that each time you test, you're making some level of improvement and you're starting to see against whatever your measure is, hey, customers come back once a week or at least twice a month. Hey, each customer is almost bringing an entirely new customer, or we're at 1.1 as a viral coefficient. Lastly, hey, we've got $5 to pay for an acquired customer, and our budget is $5, and we started paying $10, and in just a few weeks, we've got that down to $6. Well, I would persevere with that because it looks like your momentum, your velocity is pretty good. But it's always when you're flatlining and the result's just not quite good enough, this is the moment to ask the question, pivot or persevere? Now, just lastly, there's all types of pivots that you can make. Now, because I made this point that so many great companies, started doing something else. Twitter was a podcast service, for example. Pivots are actually a really standard thing. It's really normal, no problem. And it's really important to embrace it because you know what? Sometimes we get way too stubborn with our products and we just stay on a thing because that's what we promised someone. That's what we raised capital with. That's what we promised our bosses. Or I just think that's a good idea. Well, why don't you just say, look, not happy with the results. Don't feel like we're quite there. I'll go and do a pivot and see what that yields me. Maybe I come back to the original idea, but let's try some different options, and you've got plenty. So probably the biggest two are the zoom out and the zoom in pivot. So zooming out is where you've started doing a small feature, solving a small problem, and you're like, maybe we're not solving enough of the use case. So you zoom out and say, hey, we're going to be a bit broader. We're going to try and do a few more things so we can give a high level of satisfaction to the customer. So that's what we call zoom out. Now, the inverse of that is a zoom in, where you try to do too much. And actually, PayPal is a great example. They tried to be an online bank, but emailing money to your friends, that was the idea. So they zoomed into that feature. Very important and really fun if you think about it. What could be if we zoom out, zoom in, or somewhere in between? Really exciting because a world of possibilities, open up. And look, there are so many other places you can pivot on. I won't list them all for you. If you would like to see them all, jump on over to bottomup.io where you'll see all of our masterclasses. You can get, a whole deep dive into this. You can get the decks. It's totally free to register. You can get over there, but just a couple of areas you can. I want to whet your appetite. So here's a couple of areas you could consider pivots in. You could change your customer segment, or you could stay with your customer but just change the need. You could change platforms. You could charge in a different way. You could go from SaaS to one time to retail. You could switch your engines of growth. You could change your channels. You could go from email to social, IoT, whatever. Or actually, you might even find that you need a different technology approach. All of those are legitimate pivots. You would look at your venture hypothesis as your starting point here. You would use that as a way to play with factors. And we did a whole episode on those, so you can just go into our archive and dig that up as well if you are interested in that. So there you have it. The big question, pivot or persevere? I really do hope that in this 10 minutes together, you got some inspiration or some practical tips on how you can ask this question and make a better product. So to all the designers, creators, builders, and entrepreneurs out there, I really do encourage you to jump over to bottomup.io, where we're all about giving product people the skills they need for their growth and for their products to grow as well. All right, I'm Mike Parsons. I'm the CEO of Qualitance, and that was another episode of the Bottom Up Skills podcast. That's a wrap.